All right, and I believe we're live. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what part of the world you may happen to be in. Thank you for joining us today. I'm John Dotson, the Deputy Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank and policy incubator located in the Washington, D.C. area, and we're focused on contemporary Taiwan-related issues and U.S.-Taiwan, relations. Today, we're going to have a conversation on Taiwan defense policy, and our theme selected for it was the issue of Grayzone operations or cross-channel invasion. How should Taiwan prioritize for its defense? In recent years, there's both been a decided shift in the military balance across the Taiwan Strait in favor of the forces of the PRC. But at the same time, there's also been a growing concern with the aggressive Grayzone operations and territorial incursions carried out not only by PRC military forces, but also by government-controlled or directed non-military forces, such as fishing boats, Coast Guard, and so forth, as well as the regular flights into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, thereby infringing on Taiwan's territorial space. So with this backdrop, there's been considerable debate, I think, both in defense circles and national security circles in both Taiwan and abroad and in Washington, D.C., as to where Taiwan should best allocate resources and attention for its defense. Should it be upon preparing for a cross-channel invasion or to stop a cross-channel invasion, and therefore to invest in the sorts of resources that would be emphasized by the overall defense concept introduced a few years ago? Or is it the case that Taiwan, as some others have pointed out or argued, that Taiwan also needs to invest in more traditional platforms, ships and aircraft, necessary to respond to Grayzone incursions? So we'd like to look at this question as to, how should Taiwan best allocate its resources for its defense? Now, when we selected this conversation earlier this year, that was prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and against that backdrop, that obviously puts some of these questions in a somewhat different light, perhaps, particularly in light of the commonalities that Ukraine and Taiwan share, both as emerging democracies and democratic states under threat by a larger, more powerful authoritarian neighbor with designs on its territory or perhaps on its sovereignty entirely. So obviously that's going to play into today's conversation as well. For today's conversation, we're very fortunate to have with us today three distinguished guests, beginning with Eric Chan, who is a research fellow with us here at GTI. Aside from that role, in his primary job, Eric is the Senior Korea-China Strategist at the U.S. Air Force's Checkmate Directorate, where he provides both Air Force and Department of Defense leadership with assessments on North Korea and Chinese military capabilities, political leadership. And prior to this, Eric was previously the China, Korea, Philippines, and Vietnam Country Director at the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force for International Affairs. And Eric has published extensively for publications including the U.S. Air Force Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, The Diplomat, War on the Rocks, and our own in-house publication here at GTI, the Global Taiwan Brief. So Eric, thank you for joining us. We're also very proud to have joining us. Well, first, I think special credit goes to Dr. Lee, to Lee Jun-yi, who gets the credit for joining us from the furthest distance from Washington, as well as the most inconvenient time, as he is joining us from Taipei, where it is currently just after 10 p.m. So a special note of thanks to you, sir, Dr. Lee, for joining us at such a late hour. But Dr. Lee received his PhD in International Relations from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom, and he is currently an Associate Research Fellow in the Division of National Security Research at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research, INDSR, in Taipei, and INDSR serves as, would it be fair to say, so a semi-official think tank associated with the Ministry of National Defense in Taiwan. And he has previously also taught at Damgang University and National Zhongzheng University in Taiwan. And his areas of research focus include the foreign and security policies of small states, non-traditional security, and Grayzone conflicts, one of the topics that we intend to look at today. So thank you for joining us, sir. And last but certainly not least, we also have with us Dr. Raymond Guo, who is a political scientist with the RAND Corporation, where he focuses on international security, particularly and international order, but particularly international security issues in East Asia. And Dr. Guo has recently published 2 books, actually, over the past year. The first being Following the Leader, published by Stanford University Press, dealing with the topic of military alliances. And the second book, if one wasn't enough, Contests of Initiative, which deals with China's maritime gray zone strategy. So, Dr. Guo, thank you for joining us as well, sir. I believe as I said to our guests, by the scientific method of pulling slips of paper from a hat, the order I'm going to go in today will begin with Dr. Guo, if you could begin with us, sir, and then we'll go to Dr. Lee, and then to Mr. Chan. And I'll offer you each roughly about 10 minutes or so to speak on the topic. We can give you a little bit of flexibility if you wish to go a bit beyond that. But we'll have time for each of you to give your thoughts or comments on these issues. And then when that is done, we'll turn to audience Q&A. And for those watching us online, I would like to remind all of you that you too are part of this conversation. If you have questions that you wish to address to our guests, you can either enter them into the YouTube chat window. If you are watching on the live stream, the YouTube, just enter your questions or comments there into the chat window, or you can also email them to the email address contact@globaltaiwan.org. Either way, and we'll be monitoring those questions either in the chat stream or in email, and I will be selecting from those to relay those to our 3 distinguished guests. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to our speakers, and we'll begin with Dr. Guo. The virtual floor is yours, sir.
Great, thank you all so much for having me here. I'm just delighted to be speaking to GTI. So I'm going to try, and maybe this won't be successful, to discuss the lessons that China may be perceiving, or I guess the United States should also be perceiving, from the Russia-Ukraine situation, and then hopefully reconnect that back to the theme of today's discussion about gray zone versus cross-strait invasion scenarios. Which one should Taiwan prepare its force posture around? So, prior to the invasion, there was a lot of analysis saying that generally that China should not be drawing any connections from what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, and kind of putting that onto the relationship between Taiwan and China. There's Ukraine's apparent weakness, the fact that it doesn't really have any sort of security guarantee, even weaker than, say, like the security guarantees that are afforded by the Taiwan Relations Act of the United States. The idea that the U.S. has made a pretty firm commitment to Asia, and it's unlikely to try to get bogged down again within Europe, and then Taiwan will be just a very different scenario for China compared to Ukraine for Russia. Post-invasion, I think we're starting to see some new comparisons. And I think the events in Ukraine carry a lot of important implications for China, Taiwan, the United States, and other countries in the region. I think one of the major issues are twofold. People tend to, at least in the policy writing that's out there, tend to make fairly holistic statements that it's all or nothing. I think the way I'm going to present it is that we can break down to at least 4 or 5 different categories, depending on how much time I have, and they carry different implications for both China versus Taiwan, as well as Taiwan and the United States. Secondly, this is a very fluid situation. The conclusions we can make after the first 2 weeks of war are probably very different than maybe very different than we'll make at the end of it. So everything here is subject to change, and that's my kind of get out of jail free card for anything I say today. Generally, I'm going to focus on 4 to 6 different areas. The areas tend to cut against China in its in an invasion scenario, but they can complicate the US-Taiwan relationship, as I mentioned. The first one is operational military technology. I think we're very clearly seeing, one, the much more effective capabilities of man-portable A2AD weapons, anti-air area denial. So things like Stinger missiles or anti-tank weapons. Possibly we could extend this to anti-ship missiles, even though they're not exactly man-portable, but they provide an incredibly effective defense, or more effective defense than we thought. There's also civil resistance that, based on Russia's lobbing of missiles at Ukrainian cities, there may be the missiles maybe aren't as effective as we thought. Sure, we can debate their kind of level of accuracy, but more importantly, they don't seem to be having the political effect that I think Russia was hoping for, and certainly China is depending upon. China has however many thousands of missiles arrayed against Taiwan. Partly this is a political objective, that if I can threaten or even use missiles, I can get a political capitulation from Taiwan, as opposed to having to destroy the island. With Russia, we're seeing that missile strikes have not decreased Ukrainian morale. If anything, that's actually increased the morale. And so this has got to be something that China is worried about, that maybe you have the ability to destroy things, but they won't get you the political result that you want. And then also, lastly, in this sort of category of operational and military technology, is the importance of the military-to-military relationship. In 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, the US couldn't do very much because the relationship just wasn't there. There was also concerns that any technology passed on to the Ukrainians would just go straight to Russia, given the corruption and penetration of the government and the military. But since then, there's been a lot more training and assistance that provides a strong foundation to surge critical weapons when the time is right. And so on all three of those levels, I think these are lessons that both the United States, as well as China and Taiwan, should be kind of taking lessons from. In another area, there are alliances in order. There is certainly unexpected solidarity among Western allies, and by Western, I don't just mean Europe and the United States, but also including like Japan, South Korea, Australia. It's kind of tossing all the sort of within the NATO/Western bloc. There's been unexpected solidarity. I think it's a misperception on China and more importantly Russia's part that the Western bloc is kind of a spent force. There is no NATO in Asia, but Japan and Korea are possibly even more motivated than, say, France and Germany to take Taiwan's security interests clearly. Sorry, I hope that makes sense, that Japan and Korea are more interested in Taiwan than perhaps Germany and France are in Ukraine. We can debate some of this, but the very fact that you can draw some parallels between sort of semi-peripheral states and then sort of semi-core states is important for certainly for Russia and also for the China and the United States. A couple other areas, while we generally think that, I think the general perception here in the United States is that this has been a very impressive campaign fought by the Ukrainians, and it is. There's a concern, I think, within Taiwan about a trade-off between Europe and Asia. This pivot that the US keeps talking about since at least the kind of early days of the George W. Bush administration, then kind of flipped Obama, it hasn't really been funded. It hasn't really, like, the force posture isn't exactly there. We keep being kind of pulled back into either the Middle East or Europe. Are we going to see a pattern of Europe first again, given the Ukrainian situation? There's reporting from Taiwan that we are on our own. I don't know, I think that tends to exaggerate a little bit, but if the United States or EU does get bogged down in sort of a Ukraine, I don't know, their own type of gray zone or funding insurgency kind of strategy, it would possibly divert needed resources and political attention away from Asia. So that's something that actually cuts against possibly Taiwan. But I do think it's a manageable problem. Lastly, two final things, and I'll try to wrap it all up. And these are more speculative. But first off, nuclear proliferation. When we're talking about the axis of evil in 2002, 2003, it's all the bad countries that are trying to get nuclear weapons. Now, you've got Ukraine that gave up its nuclear weapons, and you've got good countries, I think, speculate maybe we should have our own independent nuclear deterrent. Because at the end of the day, while we may be able, especially those who don't have an alliance commitment, while at the end of the day, like, we might actually be on our own. And so if so, wouldn't it be better to have a small nuclear device that effectively acts as the most powerful deterrent? A friend of mine, Alexander Lenoshka, wrote a book in 2017, 2018 on how states, patrons essentially, prevent their client states from developing nuclear weapons, and it's by providing us alliance guarantees. This could be an opening for Taiwan. I wouldn't ever recommend that Taiwan should get nuclear weapons, but if this thinking is out there, then it's a possibility for Taiwan, or for the United States and Taiwan, to develop a closer relationship and kind of avert some of these dynamics. It's also important for the United States. You don't want to be suddenly dragged into a conflict that you actually are going to fight without having done the necessary preparation beforehand. And then lastly, I think the dangers of personalistic dictatorship. Yeah, Putin's been in power for 27 years. Xi's coming up on 10. Might be extending for another 5 this year, maybe indefinitely. Does Xi Jinping have enough self-reflection to identify the problems that happened between Russia and Ukraine that started with Putin himself, and to fix them? This is a matter of personal psychology. I am not a psychologist. I couldn't say, but the idea that personalistic dictatorship within political science leads to more volatile foreign policy, because you're yoking your foreign policy to the dictator's domestic political issues. And it all swings on that one actor's kind of preferences. Like, did he have a bad breakfast this morning? I think we can clearly see there, and you also have information bubbles, because you kind of fill your cabinet with yes men. We see China going down a similar path, and will lead to sort of irrational, or maybe better put, unexpected behavior from China in the same way that we see in Russia. Is there any constraint? Does a party even constrain the leader anymore? And so putting those all together, because I know I've been talking pretty broadly here, one, I think we can see that asymmetric defense, as envisioned by the ODC, is a legitimately viable defense. Seeing the kind of A2AD weapons and their effectiveness here, it seems like, yes, if you focus on a cross-strait invasion, these weapons will be pretty effective. We haven't seen the anti-ship missile stuff, but they will be pretty effective in blunting any kind of Chinese attack and allowing buying time for the United States and other allies to support. However, we do still see the lack of US political commitment as a continuing problem. Strategic ambiguity inhibits the bilateral relationship. It was a good thing that the United States, to some extent, had the opportunity in 2014 to develop that military-to-military relationship. But we're seeing the limits of even that type of relationship, that without a political commitment, your country still gets invaded. Yeah, I mean, sure, you may be able to defend it better than you would otherwise, but you still get invaded and you're still absorbing a certain cost. And that raises broader questions about prioritization. This secondly raises broader questions about regional prioritization. Does the United States care more about Europe or Asia? And to what extent will that be a problem for US-Taiwan relations going forward? And, at the end of the day, things could change really, really quickly. We have, the Ukrainians have won the information war for now. But we haven't seen much in terms of, say, Ukrainian losses, even though we see, frankly, really hilarious videos of farmers stealing tanks, which is just all kinds of hilariousness. But those sorts of situations could change really quickly. At the end of the day, I think this Ukrainian-Russian war suggests to China, at least, that it needs to be really, really cautious. And then maybe this gives some room for Taiwan and the United States. They can depend upon these A2AD technologies and give some room to focus on intra-allied and intra-partner relationships rather than focusing on the adversary, building up your own house and then kind of meeting the adversary with a more united front. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Raymond, for those comments. From listening to you, I've jotted down several points myself on which I could ask multiple questions. I think if I were to unduly hog all of our Q&A time later, which I will try very hard not to do. I know it particularly makes me think your point about asking about the nature of personalized dictatorships and the comparison between Russia now and the PRC leadership with it. It appears that what was perhaps at one time a more collective leadership at the higher echelons of the Chinese Communist Party, the Politburo and Politburo Standing Committee, whether that has become largely a one-man show, and does that increase the the dangers for Taiwan in a similar way to in that the personalized dictatorship in Russia allowed for the invasion of Ukraine. My own impression is that Xi Jinping does not strike me as a terribly introspective, navel-gazing sort of guy, and I think that's a real concern. But I'll table the rest of my thoughts on that for the moment as we proceed on. But thank you very much for your comments there. I'm going to move next and give the virtual floor to Dr. Li Junyi, joining us from Taipei, and we'll turn to you for your thoughts, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you, John, for being here. It's a great pleasure. And good morning and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll begin my short discussion by presenting my conclusions first, and then try to elaborate the arguments. Regarding the issue as Grayzone versus invasion, my conclusions are that first, these two types of threats require different governmental bodies and hence resources to react and respond. They do not form an either-or dichotomy. And second, given that Taiwan has been bolstering its national defense, and as the lessons of Russia-Ukraine war illustrates, China may rely more on the gray zone tactics to achieve its goal of unification. And my final point is that Taiwan is grappling with possible Chinese gray zone tactics, and so more scenario planning and exercises are needed. So now, let me briefly elaborate these 3 points in turn. First, gray zone operations and conventional warfare involve different bodies, resources, and strategies to respond. The armed forces are, of course, the main institution responsible for countering Chinese invasion, but the military's role in tackling Chinese gray zone operations is limited and mainly supportive, with the exception being responding to the PLA's incursion into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, the ADIZ, because there is no other agencies or bodies capable of doing so. But with respect to possible Chinese maritime gray zone operations, the main body in charge has been the Coast Guard administration, while the Navy's task is coordination. Other gray zone operations, such as economic coercion in the form of the ban on certain Taiwanese agricultural products to export to China, or cognitive warfare in terms of the United Front work, or cyber warfare, or propaganda, and so on, are political by nature, and so fall within the jurisdiction of other ministries or agencies. So I would say that gray zone and invasion are different kinds of threats, and investing capabilities to better counter one kind of the threats doesn't affect investing capabilities to counter the other, and vice versa. And my second point is that although the gap of military spending and strength between Taiwan and China has been expanding, it seems that China is likely to use gray zone tactics to subvert Taiwan rather than opt for an outright invasion. I think the assessment is based on 3 reasons. The first is the blessing of geography in conventional deterrence. The fact that Taiwan and China are separated by the strait that a Chinese attack consists of element of emphasis. Consequently, the development of amphibious vehicles and the mobilization of mass troops become crucial signs for determining the intention of the PLA. is unlikely that
Oh, we've
so
yeah,
just going on.
Yeah, yes, Dr. Lee, can you hear us? We are having a bit of some difficulty with the connection. Your voice was cutting in and out.
Right. So can you hear me now?
Yeah, well, I hear you better now. The connection sounds like it might be a little bit better. Let's proceed. Sorry.
Okay. So should I go back or just
Yes,
proceed?
if you could you review a little bit, or maybe I would go back about a minute or so. Unfortunately, the connection was kind of bad. It was difficult to hear you. I apologize for asking you to repeat yourself, but if you could do so, I think it would be helpful.
Okay, so maybe I start from my second point. Is that okay?
Sure, please.
Yes. Okay. So I think although the gap of military spending and strength between Taiwan and China has been expanding, it seems that China is likely to use Grayzone tactics to subvert Taiwan rather than opt for an outright invasion. I have three reasons for that. The first is that Taiwan enjoys the blessing of geography in conventional deterrence. The fact that Taiwan and China are separated by the Taiwan Strait means that a Chinese armed attack must consist of an element of amphibious warfare. Consequently, the development of amphibious vehicles and the mobilization of troops become crucial signs for determining the intention of the PLA. And it is unlikely that China can launch a blitzkrieg or sudden attack against Taiwan with the US, Japan, and Taiwan unnoticed. For the same reason, it is also difficult for the PLA to turn military exercises into an armed attack. And this is in contrast to the Russian invasion to Ukraine. And my second reason for that is that Taiwan has been bolstering its national defense by, for instance, increasing its national budget, developing asymmetric warfare capabilities, undertaking reservist reforms, and so on. While this may not be sufficient, they make Taiwan more resilient and raise the cost for China's possible invasion. So the first reason is that a Taiwan that is getting stronger in conventional defense is likely to prompt China to focus on unconventional means, namely Grayzone operations. Some studies suggest that since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the Ukraine government has been able to receive support from NATO and develop its capabilities in the Grayzone, resulting in Russian-backed separatists gradually losing in Ukraine. This long and slow defeat on its border is believed to be a factor, among others, that prompt Russia to go for an invasion. I think in the Taiwan Strait, we may be witnessing the reverse logic that because Taiwan is getting stronger in terms of conventional deterrence, China will now seek to use or to rely more on the Grayzone operations. And my third argument is that when speaking of Grayzone operations, there is, however, space for Taiwan to improve situational awareness. To be sure, the government, the bureaucracy, and think tanks like the NDSR now take the issue of Grayzone operations seriously. But I think we still need to have more brainstorming to come up with possible scenarios where a combination of different Grayzone operations either lead to an armed attack against Taiwan or create internal divisions within Taiwan. Otherwise, if we look at the types of threats individually, people may see the problems as minor. take the maritime domain, for example. In recent years, Taiwan's outlying islands, Kinmen, Matsu, Penghu in particular, have been facing problems of Chinese illegal fishing and sand dredging. Usually, these activities take place outside Taiwan's jurisdiction. But even if they intrude into the waters controlled by Taiwan, Taiwan's law enforcement can do little, given the sheer number and size of the Chinese vessels. And these activities create a sense of fear for the local residents, as the presence of hundreds of vessels, fishing vessels in the coastal area, generates a sense, a feeling that the island is being encircled. So from a national security perspective, these activities certainly constitute a national security problem. But the problem is that this view doesn't necessarily to be supported by the reality on the ground. Taiwan's Coast Guard and administration, for instance, maintains that there are no maritime militia units deployed in the Fujian province, and that the illegal fishing and sand dredging activities are out of Chinese local people's profit-seeking motivations. So the fact that local Chinese authorities sometimes show willingness to cooperate with Taiwan to counter these activities further strengthens the belief that there is no such a thing as Grayzone operations on the part of China. So I think there is still a lot of work to do, in particular to communicate with different agencies and the public to tell them that this kind of activities, although appearing to be minor, they may have a huge impact on Taiwan's security. But I think that belongs to the work of communication with society, and also our officers, especially those local officers on the ground. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for the host comments. Given me quite a bit to think about. I think in particular your point about again drawing comparisons between Taiwan and Ukraine, making the point that the growth in the capabilities of the Ukrainian army in the low-level war in the eastern part of Ukraine between Ukrainian military forces and the separatists backed by Russia. Your point that the growing capabilities of the Ukrainian army might have been one of the factors behind, or one of the motivations behind the Russian invasion, but making the point that sort of it may have the opposite effect in the Taiwan Strait, that if Taiwan's military capabilities improve, it could encourage the PRC to actually move more in the direction of focusing on subversive gray zone operations. That's sort of a way of thinking about it I hadn't considered before. I think that's a very interesting point. I'm gonna have to mull that over and think about that. But very interesting. But thank you for your comments, sir. We appreciate it. For our, I'll next turn to Eric Chan. Last but not least, our own research fellow here at GTI, and we'll turn to you for your thoughts. Eric, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thanks, John. Just wanted to first say, I'm really honored to be such a great group of researchers today, and I look forward to a great discussion after this. All right, so this ongoing war has a lot of significant implications for Taiwan, both on the strategic and operational levels. And I think this is not least in the way that we can best think through this dichotomy between gray zone and the invasion concern. I would say that this has actually been revealed to be something of a false choice. And the reason why I say it's something of a false choice is that because it is possible to misprioritize. And I'll take this conflict as an example. The Ukrainian President Zelensky, for instance, he discounted a lot of the US warnings about an imminent Russian invasion at the beginning of the war. and thus a good deal of the regular Ukrainian army was caught out of position when the war began. The whole time he had been thinking that this was a lot of Grayzone pressure that Putin was putting on him, but of course, when it transitioned into an all-out invasion, that's when things started to go bad. But at the same time, because Ukraine had the flexibility and the resiliency against Russian Grayzone warfare, this actually reinforced the Ukrainian ability to resist in the medium term. Ukrainian national unity and resiliency was critical in stopping the Russian concept of operations, at least the beginning concept of operations, which emphasized shock and awe. If you can't be shocked, if you can't be awed, then you've stopped the enemy, at least for the beginning. It's also been crucial in winning the global information war. And I cannot emphasize the importance of winning this war enough, because the actual operational capabilities of, say, the hastily armed and trained Ukrainian territorial guard might not be that great as Ukrainian propaganda would say, but the images of resistance has been absolutely crucial for the Western world to both open the spigot of weapons to Ukraine and also an unprecedented level of sanctions on the Russian government. So if Ukraine wins this war, it will be in part because Ukraine has effectively enlisted the globe to wage economic warfare against Russia. So they're taking this into a strategic strength. So what does this mean for Taiwan? So I think that it means that when you're talking about the question of Grayzone versus an all-out invasion, the question should really not be what to prioritize. Instead, it means that the question that we should be asking is, what do we optimize? In this case, I would identify the biggest factor in defending against both Grayzone attack or an all-out invasion would be the resiliency of the Taiwan people. Andrew Erickson just recently gave an assessment that we're in the decade of maximum danger because the PRC is reaching its maximum power. So that means that it's actually absolutely crucial for Taiwan to visibly demonstrate the determination, not just of the Taiwan military, but of the Taiwanese people. So what does this look like? So it means things like effective demonstration of quick mobilization. It means, a scheme of territorial defense as well as civil defense, simplified training regimes for territorial defense. It means things like massed stockpiles of food, water, and ammunition. This isn't just useful operationally, but it's useful as a signaling mechanism to demonstrate that Taiwan is prepared and is ready in case of an all-out invasion. This is multi-layered defense and deterrence at its finest. First, and most importantly, it forces the CCP to consider that a lightning strike to simply remove Taiwan political leadership would not be effective. Putin got himself into his current trouble right now because he assumed that President Zelensky's pre-war unpopularity must mean that Russia would be welcomed as liberators. This has been a terrible miscalculation. Second, it also creates a serious military operational problem for the CCP, because now they must consider how many forces to mass and the composition of those forces. The perceived will to fight by the Taiwan people forces uncertainty into PLA calculations. And for instance, if the PLA knows that it's going to be sucked into brutal urban warfare, just as counter-intervention forces arrive, they have to start considering how many more forces they need to build a mass before they do an invasion, and the type of forces. Is it going to be People's Armed Police? Is it going to be, heavier, heavy armor? What will it be? Finally, they would have to be able to build more ships. They would have to activate more personnel, and this would give defenders of what we would call even greater indications and warnings of any potential invasion. So finally, building resiliency here, that doesn't just mean protection against all-out invasion. It also means that Taiwan is now better protected against the morale-sapping aspects of Grayzone warfare. If the people are resilient, if the people aren't afraid, then that gives the Taiwan military greater flexibility in determining how and when to respond to Taiwan or to PRC incursions, for instance. So I want to end here by saying that, as an Air Force guy, we like to say that flexibility is a key to air power. But in this case, flexibility and resiliency is a key to being able to stop both a Grayzone attack as well as an all-out invasion. So I'll end here, and I look forward to the questions.
Okay, Eric, thank you very much for those comments. Once again, I've just in the notes I've been listening to you speak, I've got several points for potential questions or discussion from which I think I could unduly take up nearly all of our discussion time. But I don't wish to do that. I certainly wish to allow space for questions from our audience. And once again, I will remind those in our audience, if you have thoughts you wish to share and questions you wish to direct to our three distinguished speakers, please do not hesitate to do so. We welcome your input as you are part of this conversation. So please, if you have questions, either enter them into the YouTube chat window on the live stream, or you can direct those once again to contact at globaltaiwan.org via email. I think I will exercise the traditional moderator's prerogative to open up with a question or two for our guests, and just going in order. I think I'll ask a direct question to Raymond, to you, Dr. Guo, which was in part of your comments you mentioned that sort of one of the surprises, if that's the right word, maybe that's not the right word, but maybe one of the points to take away, again, if we are looking to the conflict in Ukraine for lessons, was of the effectiveness of some of these the man-portable weapon systems in targeting Russian hardware, whether we're talking about Stingers for taking out aircraft, helicopters, or fighter jets, or the Javelins for taking out tanks and other Russian vehicles. So I guess the question I would have for you in this sort of discussion or debate of asymmetric capabilities, or capabilities for resisting a cross-strait invasion, whether you think that should be focused on sorts of asymmetric capabilities emphasized by the overall defense concept, or whether you think that might be something else. My question would be, for you, Dr. Guo, but perhaps for our other guests as well, if you wish to comment on it, does the effectiveness of those weapon systems, of the Stingers and Javelins, does that further bolster the argument for emphasizing asymmetric capabilities, again, under sort of this general concept of the ODC? Does that bolster that argument that that's where military resources should be going, or not, or is that too simplistic a point to make? Would you have any thoughts or response to that? Again, both for you, Raymond, but for our other guests as well, potentially.
Sure, absolutely. It's a great question. I think I go back and forth on this. Like, I think militarily or even operationally, even tactically, the answer is yes. So you're seeing these, the effectiveness of these man-portable weapons, and there's no doubt that I think there's little doubt that it increases the idea that an asymmetric defense would actually be effective, that you can actually win or at least resist for much longer than you think, so long as you have these weapons. And so I think, but then the question I think is, that's great from a military perspective. What does it mean politically? Does that then mean, for example, okay, well, if I'm Taiwan, I know I'm going to get these weapons, and then I'll be able to resist pretty effectively, so I can therefore shift resources towards more of the gray zone or the high-end technology, so long as I'm getting these weapons. Alternatively, has Taiwan prepared its military forces sufficiently, and it's also even in its just general civilian population sufficiently to be able to receive these weapons, to deploy them, to get them in people's hands, and get the people into the position where they need to be, and to constantly resupply. I think to some extent that the effectiveness, the demonstrated effectiveness of the weapons enhances the weight of the ODC. But to some extent also exacerbates the political questions that surround adoption of the ODC in a way that I don't think we've really solved yet. I think it's going to take one greater focus by the United States and like careful diplomacy by the United States to kind of thread that needle. And two, I think Eric's point about the idea of optimizations is taken very, very well. That the more Taiwan optimizes its society and its defense for a particular concept versus not, the more it does that, the more space it frees up for resolving some of these political issues. And I don't know that we're there yet in either dimension. I feel like we're getting there, people are taking the right steps, but we're certainly not there yet in the United States. I'm not sure we're there yet in Taiwan. Hopefully that made sense.
No, certainly, absolutely. I know. Do either of our other two guests wish to chime in on that question? If so, we'd welcome your thoughts. But if not, I have other questions. I'll be happy to direct you.
One quick comment.
Mhm.
First, from this war, it's also very clear that the current stockpiles of javelins and stingers, they're being used up at an enormous rate in Ukraine right now. So that's first of all crucial for Taiwan to consider. Is this has given us great lessons on resource utilization. Second of all, again, this is getting to my point of it's really hard to say prioritize versus optimize, right? Because, for instance, think about some of the really effective Ukrainian propaganda that worked to both bolster the morale of the Ukrainian people as well as get the interest of the world, right? The very first one that came up with was things like the Ghost of Kiev, right? And Ghost of Kiev, probably not even a real person or a real pilot, but even the idea of a Su-27 shooting down 6 Russian aircraft, that really caught the attention of the world, right? In a way that it took a little bit longer for the javelins and the manpads to do later on. But for that first crucial invasion phase, having that type of story to be able to tell to the Ukrainian people and to the world about, wow, look at this, Ukrainian pilot, fighting off, the hordes of Russians. That was huge for the morale aspect of combat.
I think we now have it on record that Eric Chan does not believe in ghosts. I think we have a official statement on that now. Raymond, did you have another thought?
Just a quick chime in on that. I was actually giving a talk at the Air Command Staff College in Montgomery, Alabama, when the war broke out, and so even there, like if you're training Air Force commanders, everyone's talking like, man, it's the Ghosts of Kiev. We haven't had an ace. The world hasn't had an ace since like 1973. This guy's awesome. We don't think he's real, but the fact that he's there, the kind of meme is out there, is just a huge propaganda coup. I couldn't agree more.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for that. Next, I have a question I wanted to present to Dr. Lee. You were emphasizing in your talk sort of the point that you see a trend, or you think it likely in the future, that the PRC is going to rely more and more on gray zone operations in order to try to pressure Taiwan and to subvert Taiwan. But it was also, I was thinking as you were speaking, that when we're talking about gray zone operations, we're talking about a lot of different things, right? We have this sort of very large, vague definition, this big vague term that we apply. But as you were pointing out, when we're talking about territorial incursions using military aircraft, we talk about that as being a gray zone operation. When we have sand dredgers operating near Jinmen and Matsu, tearing up the ocean floor or reefs, we call these are gray zone operations. And I guess my question for you, or I was interested in hearing your thoughts, is do we need new language? Do we need use new terms? Like, is this term that we use, gray zone operations, is this too big and too vague? Do we need to think more specifically about this, about how we conceive of or categorize all these different sorts of pressure tactics? Do you have any thoughts on that? And I'll extend that to the rest of our guests as well.
Thank you. This is a great question, and it is also being hotly debated in the literature. But I think my own personal answer is that the Grayzone idea is useful for political purposes, because we sometimes need new terms to describe a phenomenon that has been existing for hundreds of years or even thousands of years, only to catch the attention of people, either the decision makers or the ordinary citizens. And I think gray zone operations, hybrid threats, China's three warfares, and so on and so forth, sharp power, and so on and so forth, have served the same function to bring people's attention. They remind people of Taiwan's current security situation, where our threat doesn't necessarily only come from China's ever-growing military might, but also all kinds of subversive techniques. So I think for political purpose, for raising the public's awareness, it is a useful concept. Having said that, it is the idea of gray zone is indeed a problem when we use it for analyze, because we sometimes figure out that people are talking different things, while they all use the same concept of gray zone conflicts or gray zone threats. So, but I think this is an inherent problem of language use, and so as long as it serves for the political purpose, I still think it is useful and a good thing. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Junyi, for that. Again, unless either of our other two guests wish to chime in, I had one final question that I'll address. Oh, I'm sorry, Raymond, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I think your questions is absolutely on spot, and Dr. Lee's point is correct as well. I guess one question I tend to have just for myself, and I'd be interested in what the other panelists have to think about this, is that I've always been kind of skeptical about how gray zone strategies or tactics lead to actual victory. Like, what is the Chinese theory of victory about how, bullying fishermen will result in conquest of Taiwan? Like, so the question about morale, I kind of get it, but at the same time, like, don't gray zone strategies tend to backfire and inspire their own resistance? So when you see in the case of Japan or the Philippines, you have these sorts of coercion, and it tends to increase nationalistic kind of beliefs amongst the victim recipient country. In Taiwan, I'm like, is there anything China could do more to increase Taiwanese identity? I'm not sure, but they're probably going to try. And wouldn't that just make it bad for them, right? Like, I guess I don't entirely myself understand what the theory of victory is. And so when we talk about the gray zone, I'm like, well, I mean, yes, it's helpful from a sort of public understanding process perspective, but I think the theory of victory connection is missing, at least for me. And so because I don't quite get that, I'm not sure. It makes it harder for me to say what should we prioritize, what should we optimize, how should we classify the kind of categories of coercion that are happening.
Sure. No, I think that's a very interesting point. That could lead us into all sorts of in-depth Clausewitzian discussions. How do gray zone tactics target your opponent's Schwerpunkt or not? But I think that's an excellent question. I mean, it can also lead to considerations as to whether gray zone operations are at least as much a tool for domestic or internal political mobilization, perhaps, or demonstrating strength to an internal or domestic audience than they are intended to actually impact the psychology of your opponent. I think there's a credible argument to be made there. But thanks. I have one last question I will ask myself. Again, I don't want to take up all of I have plenty of questions I could ask. but I don't want to take up all of our Q&A time. And I have a question I'll direct to Eric, but again, to our other panelists as well, if you wish to comment on it. Eric, you made the point in your talk that, again, if we look to the situation in Ukraine or parallels between Taiwan and Ukraine, that there was an initial sense of disbelief in much of Ukraine, both on the part of the political leadership and of the population, that a Russian attack was actually going to take place. But that once it did happen, there was tremendous outrage and popular resistance. And I guess my question for you is, would there be a possible parallel with Taiwan? Many people have offered the criticism over time. I'll admit I've shared in this concern, or I've had this criticism that perhaps it seems the public in Taiwan, and a lot of political leaders as well, perhaps we're not taking Taiwan's defense seriously enough, or that on the part of Taiwan's population, there seemed to be this widespread impression that we've been living under the threat from China for a very long time, but nothing's ever actually going to happen. And it would seem that in order to invest more effectively in civil defense capabilities or in popular resistance capabilities, if you're going to have some parallel to the territorial militia forces, territorial self-defense forces in Ukraine, that you have to have much more of a sense of threat, of genuine threat, in order for the population to make those sacrifices or invest in its defense. And so my thought or my question for you is, do you think that sentiment exists in Taiwan in sufficient capacity, or is it changing now? Has there been a dramatic change as an effect of the invasion of Ukraine, or how do you think that stands? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I would actually say that over the last few years, and especially right now, there's been a real groundswell of Taiwan people interested in things like civil defense and resiliency. I mean, look at Enoch Wu's camps over there, and teaching people, the basics of, first aid and resiliency, and being able to work under, highly stressful conditions, to put it that way. So I think the key point for Taiwan here is to take that next step, and not just teach like the volunteers of those camps, say just like the basics of first aid, but also get them more familiarized with firearms training. You can pick volunteers to start out with, and they will become pretty good what do you call it, like disciples for that type of
Or a
resilience.
nucleus, perhaps, for further building those capabilities?
Yes, precisely. And I think what we've seen in the Ukraine case was that they started the training for the territorial defense really seriously starting the last year, when things were starting to ramp up. It was pretty clear at that time that there was a lot of interest on the Ukrainian people, but it wasn't quite sufficient until the very day of the invasion, when when Zelensky opened up the armories essentially to the Ukrainian people. In this case, because of the flawed Russian CONOPS, and that pretty much allowed Ukraine the time to be able to, pass out the arms and give some very rudimentary training. Whereas in a Taiwan scenario case, that might not necessarily be true. So that's why I say it's hugely important for Taiwan to look at doing some of the stuff that we've seen Ukraine do in the middle of combat. Let's not do that in the middle of combat, but start getting to it earlier. And there is interest in that.
Okay, Eric, I don't know if either of our other two panelists wish to comment on that. I would welcome your thoughts. But if not, we can move on to questions we've received from our audience. Okay, all right. I think the first question, or perhaps two questions, I'll direct just to all of our panelists. These are questions submitted from Miss Tina Chung at the Voice of America. And she asks, what is the single most important thing Washington can do to bolster Taiwan's defense against a potential Chinese invasion after what happened in Ukraine? So that's the first part. So what can Washington do? And then the second question she asks is, What does the resilience and resistance of the Ukrainian people against the Russian military demonstrate in terms of how Taiwan should seek to improve its own defense capabilities? Would you gentlemen care to comment on either of those two questions? Or I tell you what, let's take the first of those then. If we Raymond, go ahead.
Sure, I'll kick us off, I guess. So
Sure.
for the first question, if I recall correctly, it's what's the single most important thing the U.S. could do to increase Taiwan's defense?
Yes, basically.
Great. So for me, and this is a drum I've been beating for a little while, it's to make a clear political commitment to Taiwan. Now, I don't want to say that, like, we should essentially jettison a strategic ambiguity, not because necessarily that kind of activates an alliance. It's a really dangerous thing to do. You have to do it very carefully, right? Like, you can't just say, we're going to defend Taiwan and then do nothing, and then China will view that as a provocation, just take over. I tend to think of it more in terms of the political benefits and military benefits it would unlock within the US-Taiwan relationship. Right now, I think a lot of Taiwanese military thinking is, we are not sure that the US is going to show up. And so strategic ambiguity has worked, right? Like, this is what you want if you want to pursue a policy of strategic ambiguity. And yet I almost feel like, and as a result, Taiwan's very logically kind of hedging its bets in terms of what it's going to do. Outcome of the policy. And in the United States, by contrast, we have this kind of perception that strategic ambiguity is increasingly unnecessary or it's not helpful, but we haven't necessarily communicated that to Taiwan. And at the same time, you've got China on the outside. Like, do we really think that China thinks that the United States thinks that it's not going to show up? Like, this kind of chain of psychology that happens, and like, it becomes increasingly untenable. But at the same time, the US, whatever benefits that the US got from strategic ambiguity in, say, the 50s and 60s and 70s, maybe now all the way through, the strategic picture has changed. The US no longer has a preponderance of power that it can swing behind any sort of partner. We have a fairly status quo oriented, not government, but just society within Taiwan. It's no longer saying we're going to go conquer mainland China. So the benefits that strategic ambiguity provided, well, they no longer exist. And right now, they're inhibiting closer cooperation between Taiwan and the United States that you could use if you're sitting in Washington to better optimize Taiwanese defenses. It kind of, that political will or that political step is what will unlock, I think, closer military and operational cooperation. So for me, that's the thing you should do. It's really tricky to do it. I think you have to prepare the ground first, because you don't want to just like make the declaration that China invades and you're all done and you're kind of stuck. But for me, that would be the big one.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, Dr. Lee, I was going to ask if you had thoughts on that, or if we could ask you sort of either what your own thoughts would be or what you've heard in terms of discussions with your colleagues at INDSR or in the Ministry of Defense in Taiwan. What are your thoughts on that, sir?
Well, my answer to the first question is that it's very much like Raymond's. If the United States government can change its stance from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity, then it would certainly bolster Taiwanese people's confidence. But it is a difficult move on the part of the United States. So the idea is that the US can maintain a strategic ambiguity stance, but at the tactical level, it can move towards clarity. For instance, it can increase its military presence in Taiwan or in the Taiwan Strait. One concrete suggestion would be for Taiwan's armed forces to be able to join as an observer of the RIMPAC, for instance, and also maybe more joint training programs, whether with the United States military or together with other Indo-Pacific countries. So, for instance, Japan or the Philippines and so on. And another suggestion is that is about language use. In Taiwan, there is a sense of U.S. skepticism. People have doubts about the U.S. political commitment to Taiwan. And I think this sense of skepticism is somehow structural. So not only the opposition party, but also some media, and also it is quite common in or among Taiwan's military officers. I taught at the Taiwan's National Defense University last semester, and surprisingly, I finally acknowledged that many of my students are skeptical of the US. They think that the best option for Taiwan is to maintain neutral in this US-China competition.
To adopt a stance of neutrality. So for Taiwan to become,
yes,
Finlandized,
yes,
or like
yes,
Finland in a way.
yeah, or to swing between US and China. And so even I try to communicate with them and telling them it is not viable given the current situation. I think it is still difficult to change how they think, how they perceive of this U.S.-Taiwan-China relations. So I think one way to try to address this issue is for the United States to change the language it uses. We usually frame the question as to whether the United States will assist Taiwan or will come to defend Taiwan. In other words, we are saying that whether the United States will help Taiwan or not. And we all know that help someone else always has its limits. At some point, people will say, okay, enough is enough, so I'll stop helping you. And I think this kind of language use produce, or at least is one source of this U.S. skepticism. And so I would suggest that the United States or we as academia or as scholars try to frame the question differently. For instance, by saying that countering China is not only a matter of helping Taiwan, it's not only a matter of Taiwan's security, but it's also a matter of the U.S. power, interest, and identity. And from here, the U.S.-Taiwan relations is not one of helper and another being helped, but as genuine partners. And I think this would give people more confidence because they would accept, or they would tend to think that the United States come to assist Taiwan not only for Taiwan's sake, but also for its own interest and power. And that's my suggestions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lee. I think that injecting in the conversation the whole question of the strain of thought within Taiwan, or people within the military establishment or national security establishment, inclining towards a position of neutrality, or that Taiwan should be neutralized in that way, I think is a very interesting point to make. And I'll admit, not something I've read a great deal on myself. That's something to think about. Let me bring in our remaining time, some of the other questions that we have. Here's one that I think is interesting. It's a very broad question, but I think an interesting one to address. This comes from Mr. Germantes Lailari, who's an author who's written for us for our publication, the Global Taiwan Brief, before. And he asks, what is the greatest threat? And I would add in with that, again, either in conventional military terms or in Grayzone terms. What is the greatest threat that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, poses to Taiwan that Taiwan is least prepared for? Again, I know that's a very large, open question, but do any of you have any thoughts on that? That could potentially be a controversial sort of question too. Actually, Dr. Lee, I see a smile on your face. Whether that's an uncomfortable smile or otherwise.
Uncomfortable.
I hate to put you on the spot. Would you have any thoughts or comments on that? Not intending to get you into any trouble. That or any of the other panelists who might wish to chime in.
I think for me, one of the things I've really seen is even the idea that, say, any sort of conflict could be long and drawn out, right? That the attitude is, either the PRC wins very quickly, or the U.S. comes in and the U.S. will win the war for Taiwan very quickly, and there's not really a lot of consideration about what happens if the war goes on for a significant period of time. I think it's important, again, just noting this current conflict. For instance, Ukraine is a major exporter of wheat. It's a big breadbasket. Yet, about a week and a half into the war, there's serious food issues, food distribution issues, food supply issues within a breadbasket. And I mean, if Ukraine has those issues, what type of issues would Taiwan have in that period of time as well? So again, considerations again for stockpiling.
Mm-hmm. Actually, if I could add in Dr. Lee, please go ahead.
I think my own answer would be that the greatest threat the CCP poses to Taiwan is the United Front work, because United Front work functions by co-opting certain actors, organizations, groups, or sectors in Taiwan. But the problem is that it is difficult for Taiwan to attribute who is doing what. So this creates internal confusions, and also worsens the tensions between different or among different groups, like those pro unification and those pro independence, or those who identify themselves as Taiwanese and those who identify themselves with Chinese. So this kind of internal division is difficult to address, and they can take the form of the freedom of expression. So I think, and that would undermine the unity and resolve that are required in an occasion where China really invades Taiwan. So I think that is the single most important threat we are facing. I think.
I'm actually very much inclined to agree. Over the last few years, much of my own writing and research has been in the field of United Front work, which is it's a topic that I find both very fascinating and very sort of troubling or disturbing when you get into it. And I think that also raises again this question as to so whether some of our definitions are too simple. Again, I think you're correct in that sort of using the term gray zone operations by itself is it's far too simplistic. That we're talking about a wide variety of phenomena, a wide variety of different tactics, some of which are military, some of which are political, some of which are psychological, leading into the political, and that trying to lump them all together under this one term, this one umbrella term of gray zone operations is kind of unsatisfactory.
Could I add a quick comment here?
Sure, please.
I would note that gray zone warfare is only effective, now that we've seen the Ukraine case, if it remains in the gray zone. Because what we've seen over the last few days is that Russian subversion of Europe and Ukraine, this was a work of over 15 years of subversion. They all went up like smoke in the last 5 days or so, right? Because what they found is that once even the pro-Russian politicians in Ukraine are under Russian artillery fire, they suddenly are not very pro-Russian anymore. It doesn't matter if you're a Russian speaker, if Russian missiles are landing on your apartment building, right? And we've even seen that across Europe, where even the most pro-Putin politicians are now backing away in horror. So there's limits to the effect of gray zone activity once the shooting starts.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question I'll bring in that I think brings a little bit more of an international dimension to this, or at least an international dimension beyond just the U.S. ties to Taiwan or interest in Taiwan. This question is posed by Mr. Paul Jobin at Academia Seneca in Taiwan, and he asks, how do you see the specific response or responses of Japan regarding China's gray zone warfare or gray zone tactics operations, whatever term you apply. But how do you see the responses of Japan to China's gray zone operations around the Senkaku Islands and beyond, including Taiwan and the South China Sea? Would any of you have any thoughts on that?
Japan's
The only thing I would mention is the book over my shoulder with the ship. That's book number 1. I don't know. That's the one about gray zone warfare, and it discusses a bit what the Senkaku Islands cases are cases within the book. I mean, I think Japan is doing generally the right steps, right? I think one of the at least what I find from my research is that gray zone strategies target those sort of unordered spaces within the international system. We don't have common rules and expectations over, who owns the Senkakus? What can you do on the Senkakus? Who do they belong to? And so one of the best ways to address or kind of resist or confront those that strategy is to close off the unordered space, like to order them, to put them under, say, U.S. military guarantee, or if not quite that, at least have the U.S. and its partners in Japan talking about what does it mean in case of X, Y, and Z scenarios. And so, at least with regard to China, I think Japan is doing the right thing, and in getting the United States to announce that Senkaku's Japanese administration, the Senkaku's falls within the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty, and I think the bigger question is that's the politics, right? What do you do against, say, the maritime militia or the Chinese Coast Guard, which can kind of flood those zones with a lot of forces and vessels? I think here political coordination is again kind of necessary. Michael Beckley's 2018 book, I think Unrivaled, he includes some really, really interesting graphs towards the end where he says, look, if we look at 4th generation fighters, submarines, Coast Guard tonnage, yes, China on its own is really powerful. But if we take China's regional rivals, just its regional ones, excluding the United States, and put them all together, then they actually have, in some cases, more of those capabilities than China does. The difficulty, of course, is that they're all split up amongst a bunch of states. And so having the political coordination and agreement to say, yes, we agree to, say, UNCLOS rules governing these kind of, the Senkakus, but also the South China Sea and all the rest of it. If you can get that sort of political agreement, then you can start unlocking the utility of those forces and kind of bringing them to bear, where you can have this sort of coordinated confrontation or competition with China in a way that actually protects a lot of the states, regional states' interests. Whether that's going to happen, I am kind of skeptical, but at least the capabilities are there, and they kind of are there for the taking. It just depends. Can any state demonstrate the leadership to bring them together?
Okay, thank you. Here's a question I'll direct to you that's been sent to us from Abby Fu with the firm Econ One Research. And she asked, how would the West's relatively united reaction against Russia affect China or the Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping's attitude on using military force for reunification? Would you say that, although it may be too early to tell, perhaps, but do you think that the difficulties that the Russian invasion has encountered, is that likely to inject greater caution into the Chinese leadership, or is it going to give them sort of cause to second guess the confidence they may have regarding an attack on Taiwan? I think Dr. Lee had, if I'm not speaking out of turn for you, you seemed to say earlier that you believe that the course of events was likely to take the PRC more in the direction of relying more on sort of subversive gray zone activities in order to try to achieve their objectives in Taiwan. But for all of our panelists, do you have any thoughts in response to Ms. Fu's question? Do you think that what has happened in Ukraine is likely to impact the calculations of the PRC leadership one way or the other?
I would like to add, so it's sort of a dual dichotomy, right? The first of all is the most obvious response is that yes, this will certainly increase uncertainty as to the success and the political costs of any invasion, right? Especially if it continues to go sideways for Putin. There's now even a threat of a color revolution in Russia if things continue to go down the path that they're going. That would certainly lengthen the expected timeline, right? On the other hand, from what she has seen, things such as trying to do shock and awe or winning the hearts and minds of the Ukrainian people, that's been a complete disaster and a failure. So knowing his response will be, then in that case, I need to use a bigger hammer, right? Not walk away, but to use a bigger hammer. So yeah, the timeline might be linked. I would also expect the response by Xi will also be, if I am to carry out an invasion, I will start it out even harder than I expected and even more bloody than I expected. So again, dual dichotomy.
Let me add to that. Let me play devil's advocate for a moment, not necessarily saying that I think this will be the response, but again, playing devil's advocate. What if one were to say, again, if we follow an analogy or parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan, that Russia essentially undertook a limited invasion of Ukraine in 2014, in which they seized control of Crimea. They set up these two separatist statelets, Donetsk and Luhansk. So that there was a limited Ukrainian invasion of Ukraine at that time. But that was in 2014. Now we move ahead to 2022. We've had 7 or 8 years in between in which the Ukrainian state had time to reform its military, for example, to begin undertaking more serious steps to allow for a defense against a larger Russian attack. So playing devil's advocate, could one say that the CCP leadership might look at this situation and say, oh, we've got to move fast before attitudes change in Taiwan, before additional defense reforms could take place. We've got to move fast to assert our control over Taiwan sooner rather than later, because the more time that goes on, perhaps, the more difficult this might become. Playing devil's advocate, how would you respond to an argument along those lines?
My argument would be that I've certainly gone around in a circle in this. I think just about a year or so ago, I had written some articles talking about the likely Grayzone threat to places like Jingmen or Matsu, right? And this is based off the Russian experience in 2014. But now that Russia has done this, has executed a massive invasion, and has caused, significant changes to, say, the structure of NATO, to how NATO is applied, to how the US is viewed, because of these on-the-ground changes. It's that invasion now, to me, this limited invasion of Kinmen, which I posited a year ago, I don't think is quite as viable anymore, because they know that, well, now the US is certainly, and Europe is now certainly more on edge, and they're going to be watching for things like a repeat of 2014.
Okay. All right. Unless any of the other panelists have further thoughts, I have one other question I'll direct to you. This comes from, I think we should have time for at least one more question, I think, in our remaining time. Perhaps 2, but we'll see. This was sent to us by Larry Delson at New York University, who asks, should Taiwan take a more aggressive approach to change the narrative in the mainland? Information warfare seems to be a one-way street originating in the mainland. And I guess myself adding a bit of a gloss to that, should Taiwan begin conducting more gray zone operations of its own, rather than just being on the receiving end? Would it be of value or not to Taiwan to begin undertaking more aggressive information operations directed at the PRC? Is there significant value in that, or is it the case that the media and information environment in the PRC is so tightly controlled that it would be difficult for much effect to be had there, or not? So what do you think? Any thoughts from our panelists on that?
Sure, I think. So if we're thinking about information operations, we're thinking about sort of social or influencing operations, I think, right? Like through social media, that kind of thing. Or at least like, and not going to like cyber attack or cyber espionage. I'm going to kind of bracket those aside. I tend to think that it's not worthwhile to target any information operation at China. We're seeing from Russia, like that there's been some media reports, and it's hard to tell how kind of widespread this is or how accurate this is or more reflective of the general population, but that Ukrainians who have family in Russia will tell them, hey, we're literally being bombed right now. And the Russians are saying, and their Russian relatives are like, no, that's just not possible. Why should I believe that? You're just making this up. And they said, your own family is not going to believe that you're being bombed. That suggests something about the information environment, how I wouldn't say controlling, but like how pervasive it perhaps is in Russia. And I would imagine China is fairly similar. For me, the bigger target for information operations, if Taiwan were to do this, is towards, you go down the UN, you go down the UN General Assembly or the UN Security Council meeting notes from, well, I guess it's 2 weeks ago now, or last week, and say which of the small states said, hey, we are supporting Ukraine because the threat to territorial sovereignty fundamentally affects us as well. Kenya is like right up there. And while, you may not get Kenya to switch diplomatic recognition, you do harp on them, or you do kind of post them like, look, if they can do this if Russia can do this to Ukraine, what does that mean? And if China wants to do this to us, what does that mean for you? If the norm of territorial sovereignty is eroding, we are the next front line, and you can kind of target your information operations there to get some of this sort of third-party support. In addition to the support you already have among, say, the American population, maybe Europe, and certainly Japan and South Korea to some extent. So if you're going to go information operation, that's where I would target. I wouldn't really target it at China. It's not really worth it. Their internet controls are too strong, but and the extent to which you wouldn't just get immediately censored by like the whatever the firewall, I think it's just kind of a lost cause there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dr. Lee, please.
And I would also like to add one point, that is, even if China launched information operations against Taiwan, it hasn't been always successful, because China or those netizens or these agencies do not necessarily understand Taiwan. So the operations usually have counter effects, or is not very productive. And I think the same also applies to Taiwan. If Taiwan were to launch information operations back to China, the problem is we don't understand. Not to say maybe we even don't have the access to influence those netizens or ordinary people in China. And so I think that is a very practical and concrete constraint.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that it depends on the audience that you would be targeting. I agree with the overall sentiment that it's probably not the highest effective route for Taiwan to go. But if you were to conduct information operations against the PRC, the main target probably shouldn't be the Chinese people, but rather certain echelons of the party, right? You insert enough information to let the higher echelons of the party know that any sort of war against Taiwan would likely be uncontrollable and could very well lead to the destruction of the party. It's probably going to be minor compared to the type of threats that other nations, such as the US, could exert, but any little bit would help. But again, on the other hand, I don't think it's particularly high efficiency here. I do agree with the other panelists that if you were to look at some of the nations that have been supportive of Ukraine in this conflict, that'd be a great way to go for, really pumping up the values based or diplomacy that Taiwan has been executing very successfully as of late. I can only imagine what the Ukraine's particular feelings about China are at this moment, seeing as how it looks pretty clear to me that Putin pretty much talked to Xi beforehand about his invasion of Ukraine. So yeah, there's certainly aspects of this that Taiwan can really work on in information operations.
Okay, thank you, Eric. We are nearly out of time. We're butting up against our time window, but I will perhaps address one final question to our panelists, and this is to kind of bring things back to the sort of the original topic or the starting point for the discussion. This question of whether Taiwan should seek to prioritize its defense resources again to prevent a cross-channel invasion, or whether it needs to focus on Grayzone operations. And drawing from some of the comments from Dr. Lee, who was stressing the point that Grayzone operations, again, being diffuse, or since they take many different forms, that they really require response by many different agencies of government. If you if you have dredgers or fishing vessels encroaching upon your maritime space, or operating in close proximity to your islands, this is a job for the Coast Guard. But in terms of countering United Front activity, is that a process for? Is that really even something that's really primarily a government responsibility? Is that something that do you need more investigative journalism for that, perhaps? So I guess the sort of the general question I would ask, again, to bring it back to the starting point of our conversation, where should Taiwan or how should Taiwan prioritize its defense resources in responding to the threats coming from the PRC? If you have any final concluding thoughts on that, I think we'll wrap up the conversation there.
Well,
Dr. Lee, please.
I think investing in national defense capabilities remains the first priority, because having a war from China is the least thing we want. And on the other hand, investing in national defense include not only purchasing weaponry from the United States, but also involves a whole lot of things like reservist reform, communication with the society, and also education, and so on and so forth. And so investing in all of this would also help us to be more resilient in countering the Grayzone operations, whatever it is.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Lee, and Junie. I think you're going to get the final word on that, I believe, since we are out of time and running a little bit over. I want once again to extend a note of thanks to all three of our distinguished panelists, Dr. Junie Lee from INDSR in Taipei, and once again, sir, we apologize for making you stay up so late. We're very appreciative of your time in staying up so late to speak with us today, but also to Dr. Raymond Guo of RAND, and Mr. Eric Chan of the Checkmate Directorate and of GTI. Thanks to all three of you for your time and for your comments today, and thanks to our guests who have been watching online. We encourage you to keep an eye out for further discussion events that we'll be holding at GTI next month. I expect we'll be having another panel discussion on EU-Taiwan relations, so keep an eye out for that. But thanks to everyone for joining us today. Have a great day. Goodbye.